I think we're about ready to get going, so good morning all.
Is there a third person?
Our third, yeah. So we are privileged this morning on our session on psychology and anthropology, the sensory and beyond, to have three esteemed speakers. The first two speakers are present in the room. The third will be joining us through Zoom, for which we are very grateful. Our first speaker this morning is Francis Feingold, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Kenrick-Glennon Seminary in St. Louis. His research centers on Aquinas metaphysics, especially natural theology, angelology, and the ontology of action, as well as his ethics and political philosophy. The title of his presentation is How Can Aquinas Demons Make Mistakes Without Composing or Dividing?
So, thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So, Aquinas, as you all know, has quite a lot to say about angels. And he can make some very striking claims about them. At least to me, one of the more striking claims is that they know without composing and dividing. That is, non-propositionally, by a simple cognitive act, which sometimes Aquinas calls simple apprehension. That's already striking. It becomes even more striking when held together with another claim that Aquinas also makes, which Father Bonino was describing to us yesterday, that some angels, demons, can be outright mistaken in this non-propositional knowledge of theirs, at least regarding supernatural matters. That's very puzzling indeed, I think, because even if we grant that angels somehow can grasp everything real about the object in a single, simple act, it would seem that making a mistake would then require adding something to that initially grasped reality or subtracting something from it. So that's the puzzle that I want to address here. To go about that, I want to start by exploring Aquinas' argument for non-propositional knowledge, because that will turn up the heat on the puzzle, so to speak. So why does he insist that angelic knowledge never involves what we call the second act of the mind, composing and dividing? Why does he hold that angels instead somehow grasp truth, grasp existence, without our human need to form mental propositions? And I completely forgot, I have a handout here. Could I ask one of you to pass it out? That would be very great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I apologize. The handout has a lot of fine print. It's basically, my footnotes for this paper. So Aquinas makes this claim about non-propositional knowledge mainly in relatively late works, in the Prima Pars of the Summa and in the De Malo. And just 3 articles that I'm aware of. So let's look at the longest one, which is the Summa article, which is your text 1 on that handout, question 58, article 4. All right, so what you would find in that article if you read through it is that he starts by drawing a parallel between discursive reasoning, which he had ruled out of the angels in the preceding article, and propositional predication. Right? What they have in common is that they both presuppose an initial imperfect grasp of the starting point, right, of the principle in reasoning or of the subject in predication. Whereas a perfect initial grasp of the starting point implies also grasping everything connected with that starting point, right? Since angels' initial grasp of the object's quiddity is perfect, Aquinas thinks, they need no further cognitive act to grasp all those predicates that are connected to that object in some way. Okay, it's already a bit of a stretch, but it's easy to accept that if we're talking about things that follow by logical necessity from the essence. Okay, I get that, right? With deductive syllogisms, essential properties, but Aquinas takes it a little further. In your third text on the back side of the page. Aquinas, in the little bit that I underlined there, he makes it explicit that this non-propositional knowledge applies not just to essential properties, but also to accidents and relations, right, which belong contingently, presumably, right? And in the last text, at the very bottom of text 4, in the reply to the sed contra, he says not only, right, accidents and contingent properties, but even esse itself they can grasp by this simple act, whereas for us humans, Aquinas frequently says that you have to grasp esse by the act of composing and dividing. That's why truth resides primarily there. All right, so just to be clear, to avoid confusion, Aquinas is ruling out composing and dividing in angels, is not ruling out judgment. Right, in the article that immediately follows text 1, right, so text 2, the article on angelic falsity, he explicitly attributes judgments to the angels while continuing in the same breath to deny composing and dividing. So I take it that what's going on here is that judgment, right, so this is confusing for us because we as Thomists usually take judgment and composing and dividing as just two words for the same thing, second act of the mind. But for Aquinas, I take it judgment refers to any act of the mind, simple or complex, whose object is a composite, let's say, state of affairs, what Aquinas calls an enunciabile, whereas composing and dividing refers to a complex act, which grasps, right, so it's got a composite object, and it's a complex act, which grasps that composite object by joining a previous act's object, in this case, the imperfectly grasped subject, to a new object, which is the predicate. Right, so this means that even if we call the angel's act simple apprehension, it's only analogous to our simple apprehension. It's got all three roles baked in, so to speak. Okay, so that's an important thing to get out of the way, but that terminological clarification by itself doesn't explain how grasping in essence lets you grasp its accidental predicates, including actual existence. So I explore that question at length, too much length, elsewhere in an article that Therese Corey here and Greg Dooling graciously included in their Festrit for the late Monsignor Whipple. It's available at the bookstore next room over. Don't get it for my article, but there are lots of other more worthwhile things there. Get it for that. For right now, the very short answer would be that for Aquinas, why would they know existence by and contingent predicates by the simple act? Because they know by these concreated intelligible species that are, I'm quoting him now, multiplied representations of God's single and simple divine essence. Right, so unlike our intelligible species that we reach by abstraction, these angelic ones are rich rather than empty, right, being like God's own essence, of which they're kind of a reflection, proper, and not just proper, but eminent likenesses of every possible instantiation of that species, including the individual matter that all of us have. Right? So Aquinas says that explicitly. Aquinas does not say this next thing explicitly, but I suggest that these angelic intelligible species, as images of God's creative art, so to speak, would also be likenesses of God's causation of the existence of the things that fall under those species. So as a result, for an angel to activate one of its intelligible species just is for it to both see everything of which that species is currently an eminent likeness, and also to affirm, to judge those objects' divinely caused existence. So for us, by contrast, such affirmation would require composing our abstracted intelligible species with our singular phantasm to get at the singular subject of the judgment, and also with our sensory awareness of being causally acted on, which is how we get at the real existence. So lots of composition for us. Angels can get rid of all that. Okay, so now with that out of the way, we can go to our actual problem. We've given an account of how an angel can have complete knowledge of how an object really is without composing or dividing, but then how can they make mistakes? So in your text 2 and your text 4, in the Summa and De Malo text, Aquinas appeals to, and as Father Bonino reminded us yesterday, Aquinas appeals to the fact that supernatural realities transcend the angel's natural knowledge. Right? So essentially, those concreated intelligible species of theirs are not proper likenesses of these supernatural realities. So even their full natural knowledge of the object's essence would have a lacuna, a blind spot. Right? Their simple intellectual act, in other words, is grasping the object as not composite enough, right? Too simple, omitting the supernatural dimension of God's providence and his action concerning that object. Right? And crucially, Aquinas thinks it's at least possible for the angels not just to have this merely partial grasp of the object, which he calls in the De Malo text the defect of simple negation, defectus simplicis negationis. This is in the last, I think it's in the last paragraph of the body. Anyway, but also to falsely affirm this partial grasp as being the whole story. Now, that's the defect of false opinion, the actual false judgment. There's an interesting difference between the Summa text and the De Malo text here. In the Summa text, he appeals to the idea of per accidens falsity to explain what's going on with this false judgment, right? So comparing it to our distorted grasp of an essence or something like that. In the De Malo text, which is later, he drops that. Like, per accidens falsity makes no appearance, and he compares it not to our simple apprehension issues, but to our composing and dividing issues. Right? And I think he's right about that because, right, the central thing is, are you getting at the essay of the object or not? Are you affirming its reality or not? Right, so I think that move is right, but it also makes the problem a bit more acute. Okay, so Aquinas, and so he thinks that this is possible for the angels because of this, they don't have natural knowledge of supernatural realities, but to get to that defect of false opinion, you need pride in the angel's will as a necessary condition. So a good angel, let's hypothesize a not actual good angel who does not enjoy supernatural knowledge. Right, so such a good angel would have a blind spot, yes, but such an angel would also be humble enough to be aware of that blind spot. Right, so that is, they know that God's wisdom is above their own wisdom. You might even speculate, Aquinas doesn't say this, but that their humility, their virtue of humility, gives them a kind of connatural ability to maybe appreciate the mystery of God's own humility in dealing with creatures. So they're at least open to the possibility that God's ways might not be their ways. And so they make judgments about God's supernatural providential plan only, in my translation, with deference to God's ordination, right, with caveats, right, as conjectures. Right, so to use Aquinas' example about the angels knowing the divinity of Christ, right, if this hypothetical good angel activated his intelligible species of man around 30 AD, this simple grasp would do, I think, these three things. It would simultaneously categorically affirm that this man named Jesus existed, was wise and virtuous, right, that's all under his species. Categorically denied that he was, let's say, a cow, right, since that would be incompatible. And conjecturally affirmed anything that's not incompatible, but like subject to God's power, right? So might just possibly be God. Hypostatic union's not visible to him, but it's also not logically incompatible with Christ's humanity or with God's wisdom. Okay. Whereas the bad angels, what's going on with them? Aquinas sure looks like he's saying that they take the same defect of simple negation, right, which includes this conjectural affirmation, and modifies it to reach their defect of false opinion. Right, so in the Summa text, he says that their perverse will draws their intellect away from God's wisdom and brings about an unconditional, absolute judgment. In the De Malo text, he says that it's thanks to their proud will that they, I didn't know how to translate this, they exhibent. I said they trot out, like they've got this aspect of both applying and showing off their intellect and make it burst forth into a unconditional judgment. Right, so the role of the will seems to imply that making this rash judgment is a choice, and Aquinas' use of that term burst forth, prorumpunt, suggests that this rash judgment adds something over and above the demon's original neutral apprehension. Right, so, I mean, and that's our worry. It looks like, isn't that composing? Okay. So, Cognition and John of St. Thomas, I take it, follow that straightforward reading. I'm going to skip Cognition for the sake of time, just focus on John of St. Thomas, who's more explicit. So here's his commentary on that bit. I'm sorry I didn't include this in the handout. So he says, quoting my translation, the simple act in the angel by which he judges of different objects can have a virtual falsity. He's borrowing that term from Cognition. He likes that. Inasmuch as attaining the truth about those things that lie in his natural capacity, he does not stop that judgment, but rather continues on in the same way about those things that are represented to him only conjecturally. So he's starting from a conjectural judgment and then goes on. Hence, the demon, by his full light, is aware that this object does not manifest any such truth except conjecturally or contingently, and yet, aware of this, nonetheless wills to extend himself further and judge about this hidden and merely conjecturally known thing as if it were certain and evident to him. And he goes on to repeat, this is deliberate, this has not come out of ignorance, this is right, clear-eyed, he knows what he's doing. Right, so on this picture, I take it the demon's proud will is, you might say, downstream of their initial judgment, their initial grasp, and adds to it. All right, so I love John of St. Thomas. I don't want anybody to come away with the wrong impression. He's my go-to for any questions that I have about Aquinas. That's why he's fun to tussle with. He's probably right, but I'm going to push back on him anyway. So I've got two main worries about this picture. All right, so the first is with that notion of extension. Right, which follows from the idea that it's up to the angel whether or not to judge falsely. Right, I look at that word, and it seems like that's smuggling in composition by another name. Right, because what are you doing? You're taking an already complete act, a vision of everything that's real in the object, on the natural level, including its possible connection to hidden properties, and you're adding an affirmation of some of those hidden properties. But the whole essence of composing and dividing as distinct from the angel's simple judgment is precisely that you're adding something not present in your initial intuition of the thing's essence. So it seems to me that this would apply equally to the standard case, an initial imperfect grasp to which you add a true predicate, and also to an initial perfect grasp to which you add a false predicate. Either way, right, the act of grasping the subject doesn't itself include grasping the predicate, right? Can't in the case of the demon's false judgment because it's not there to be grasped. And it seems to me that this argument holds regardless of whether this false predicate is added like chronologically after the subject is grasped or temporally simultaneously, because even in the simultaneous case, again, you're still adding something that's not there in the grasp of the subject, right? So this is why Suarez, who's one of John of St. Thomas's interlocutors, thinks that angels would have to compose and divide whenever they assent to a conjecture. I think he's right about that. I just think angels don't ever actually categorically assent to something that they know is just conjecture. Right? So this brings me to my second problem with John of St. Thomas's solution. It's not clear to me that Aquinas thinks that deliberate self-delusion of this explicit sort, so forcing myself to believe something I know to be false, is actually possible for anyone, angel or otherwise. And I've got some text to support that, and we can get in the Q&A to the role of the will and faith, and it's complicated. I'm just going to say that for right now. Right, what Aquinas does clearly allow, certainly in the case of the angels, is a self-delusion of a different sort. Right, deliberate non-consideration, averting our eyes from the true good, right? Which, unfortunately, that's very possible indeed, right? That's all sin, including angelic sin, as far as Aquinas is concerned. But actually affirming something that you know to be false, I don't see Aquinas ever saying that in his theory of angelic sin, right? So in a striking text, this is not on your text either, I'm afraid, Summa Contra Gentilis, book 3, chapter 108, when he's talking about the fall of the angels, he raises this as an objection to the possibility of their fall, right? They don't compose and divide, so they can't have error, they can't judge falsely, and so, right, you would need a false judgment in order to sin. And you might expect him to answer by defending the possibility of false judgment even without composition and division. But he doesn't do that, right, because he doesn't think that could happen before the fall. Right, instead, his answer in chapter 110 is that we do not need to say that there was error in the intellect of the separate substance in judging that something good is not good. Right? That would be the explicit false statement. But rather, I'm still quoting, in not considering the higher good to which his proper good was to be ordered. Right? And it's that non-consideration which goes back to the demon's will. Right, and Aquinas also takes this line against the inerrancy objection to angelic sin in all his other treatments of angelic sin, as my Dr. Vater, Tobias Hoffmann, has recently shown in his book on the rebel angels. So if I understand this right, what this means is that the practical judgment on which the demon acts is not a mistaken all things considered judgment, right, that my choice is better than God's good, but rather a limited, true as far as it goes, judgment, which is my good really is good, choice-worthy in itself. right? And it's only after their fall that the angels can actually be outright mistaken. Okay, so if I'm right in challenging John of St. Thomas here, right, if his reading is wrong, what's the alternative? So here's my proposal. I would suggest that the key role of the demon's pride isn't in impelling them to hasty or imprudent judgments, which is how John of St. Thomas reads it, but rather in preventing them from seeing in the first place that God even might have a supernatural modus operandi beyond their comprehension. Right? So thus, for example, they wouldn't be able to see Christ's divinity or the triumph of the cross as even a live possibility. How would pride have this effect? I think both A, right, by making them think they can understand the workings of God's wisdom, right, and also maybe B, by preventing them from recognizing even the possibility that God might choose to take on creaturely form or redeem us by suffering or something like that. Right, so there would thus already be a morally based flaw in their initial simple grasp of, let's say, wisdom, right, which blinds them to the possibility that God's wisdom might dictate certain actions. Right? So in other words, unlike the good angels, the demons, after their fall, are blind to the very incompleteness of their own knowledge. Right? They've got you might say, a double blind spot, not just a single one. Right? So if that's right, then the demon's original act of thinking about Christ will just be a categorical denial of Christ's divinity, right? Since, as we said earlier, every angelic cognitive act includes a categorical denial of everything not seen as compatible with the subject. And so the devil's evil will would thus be upstream, not downstream, of the demon's original judgment, which remains unchanged. So what are the advantages of my proposal? Well, first, I think it resolves the problem at hand. You don't have to sneak composition in by the back door. Right? There's no correct initial judgment that you'd have to then tweak or add to. By the same token, it means the demons don't have to explicitly assert a judgment that they know to be false, which seems psychologically weird. And third, as an exegetical matter, it also explains why Aquinas himself limits the possibility for demonic error to the supernatural. Because it's only with respect to the supernatural that they have this double blind spot. For other hidden things, like secrets of the heart or future contingents, right, they would know their limits and judge accordingly with shrewdness. Demons are shrewd, right? They're not imprudent, right? Except insofar as the supernatural is involved. Right? So where John of St. Thomas explicitly extends this to all of those hidden things, and he has to, right? Because hastiness is just like fires all over the place. Okay. But lastly, and more deeply, if I'm right, I think the takeaway is that sin, rather than making us hasty, as John of St. Thomas would seem to say, instead makes us blind, shutting down our horizons and giving us the kind of ignorance that Socrates identified as our worst affliction, right? Not knowing that we don't know. So in that vein, I'd like to conclude by, this is probably not very academic, quoting a favorite line of mine from Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring. Right, so this is in Gandalf's mouth at the Council of Elrond, where he's arguing that his plan of bringing the ring to Mordor to destroy it right under Sauron's nose at least isn't hopeless. Right, he grants that it looks like folly. But he says, and here I'm quoting, "Let folly be our cloak, a veil before the eyes of the enemy. For he is very wise, and weighs all things to a nicety in the scales of his malice. But the only measure that he knows is desire for power, and so he judges all hearts. Into his heart the thought will not enter, that any will refuse it, that having the ring we may seek to destroy it. If we seek this, we shall put him out of reckoning." So I take that to be Tolkien's version of Father Bonino's point yesterday about the scandal of the cross. Right? Even if we say that the demons could eventually come around to recognizing that Christ really must be the Son of God, right, based on the miracles and the things Christ is saying, right, still one thing that they can't get is this supernatural folly of God's plan of redemption. So to avoid this blindness, we have to become like the good angels, connatured to the mind-shattering humility of our God. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for raising this very interesting question, and or at least for a few people, it's a very interesting question. But I think I could say it should be interesting for more people if we understand it. I think it's an important point that there is judgment in the angelic cognition, because as you mentioned, Judicium came to be terminologically identified with a second operation of intellect, but this is not the case for Aquinas.
Right.
And Judicium is a broader category.
Yes.
And what I think well, you have a larger proposal, but I think the first thing to understand is what means judgment in a non in a cognition that is not like our cognition, the second operation of the intellect.
Yeah.
And because I think the correct way of understanding Aquinas is the truth is in the second operation, because in the second operation there is a judgment, not the other way around. And he also says there is also judgment in the senses. And I think this is an avenue to understand in which sense there is judgment in an operation like the angelic cognition. So that is
yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. When I was writing that initial paper for the Festschrift, Therese Corey pointed me in precisely that direction, that you have judgments both above and below are the level of our composing and dividing, right? So you've got God's judgment on the one hand, but you have the sensory judgment on the other, right? And so what the senses don't have is, right, so they're getting at existence, and they're getting at existence through the causality of the sensible object on us, right? And if you're Norris Clark, you would say something about like how action reveals existence, and I think you'd be right about that. And he does say there's a kind of sensory act which he thinks is more akin to composing and dividing, and that has to do with the operations of the estimative power, precisely because it involves taking different acts, the terms of different acts, and putting them together. Right, so I think the key is, right, something counts as judicium if it somehow or other gets at esse, which if you're not God, you have to do through causality. Right, so our senses are able to do that, and I'm arguing that the angels kind of do that in a reverse way by like getting at causality through the God to creatures side of things. We could say a lot more, but
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I wanted to ask about your objection to John of St. Thomas. I'm not sure I exactly followed it.
Sure, sorry.
But yeah, I kind of wanted to defend him if I could.
Please.
So if I understood correctly, you said that he located the error in the demon's judgment in that they're seeing something conjectural, judging it as certain when it's merely conjectural, and that was they're extending their intellect in that way by an act of will, by their act of will. Actually, interestingly, it reminded me of Descartes' explanation of error too, how your will.
Yes, I almost mentioned Descartes in that bit. I thought that'd be a little rude to John St. Thomas, but
so earlier too, you said that for Aquinas, judgment itself doesn't necessarily involve composing and dividing, because what matters is that its object is a composite state of affairs.
Yes.
Right? So here maybe is one way of understanding John of St. Thomas's point. This is sort of anachronistic, but could it be understood as seeing a merely possible state of affairs as if it were actual, right? So here's a merely possible, probable state of affairs, but I judge it as actual, even though I don't really have a reason to do that. And I just don't see in what sense would that involve composing or dividing.
Yeah, no, great question, right? And that going against the master like John of St. Thomas, one should tread cautiously. But so if what you mean by seeing that it's possible and then judging it more. Right. So let me back up. So I take the essence of composing and dividing to be, right, you've got a grasp, right, and this grasp gives you all this stuff, and then, right, you have to do more, right? You have to bring in something that was not in that grasp, right? And so if, right, the mistake just consists in, right, my grasp was messed up, right, such that my judgment, my affirmation of what I'm grasping is also messed up, that's fine. That's my proposal. But if you're saying that they get it right, they know they've gotten it right, and then they say, I'm going to go ahead and like make it into something that I know is wrong anyway, that's the part which seems as though you're adding something onto something originally intact.
So you'd have to like predicate, so you'd have to be predicating actuality of the state of affairs.
Right. Predicating certainty of something that you know is conjectural.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking of it more like you have some sort of illusion that you take to be real. I mean, does that have to involve, I guess maybe you were thinking it has to involve the judgment, this is real, and not just like accepting it.
Right.
And with apologies, but we're at about end of time. This might be a very informative discussion to continue after the session, and apologies for those who had questions that were being held. I'm very sorry.
Thank you.
I would like to introduce our next speaker, Drew Rosato, a graduate of the Medieval Institute at Notre Dame, teaches at the California campus of Thomas Aquinas College. His research is in 13th and 14th century theology. His paper is titled, A Defense of Aquinas' Account of Prophetic Knowledge.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that introduction. St. Thomas examines prophecy at length in both his De Veritate and Summa Theologiae. For St. Thomas, the category of prophet would include any author of sacred scripture, and not only those who are explicitly designated as prophets. Thus, St. Paul possesses prophetic cognition just as much as Isaiah. It is for this reason that Thomas looked to St. Thomas's writings on prophecy to develop an account of biblical inspiration. A prophet possesses supernatural knowledge that he can teach to others, thereby making public what God wishes to be included in divine revelation. When St. Thomas describes prophetic cognition, he draws on resources from Aristotle's account of our sensory and intellectual knowing powers. For this reason, St. Thomas will speak of the need for a prophet to possess sensible and intellectual species and to have recourse to intellectual light. Yet, to account for the supernatural character of prophetic cognition, St. Thomas adapts these basic Aristotelian cognitive principles in various ways. After setting out St. Thomas's understanding of prophetic cognition, I will look at criticisms leveled against it by the great French Dominican theologians Jean-Pierre Terrel and Serge Thomas Bonino, who argue in various ways that St. Thomas departs too far from his Aristotelian principles by positing the infusion of species into the imagination and mind of the prophet. They also object to Aquinas' claim that the inner illumination provided by the prophetic light is given only temporarily to the prophet. I will argue, however, that these features of Aquinas' account of prophecy are necessary to explain certain types of knowledge that we normally attribute to some of the prophets. So now for a very brief sketch of some things St. Thomas says about prophetic cognition. Some of St. Thomas's predecessors claim that a prophet sees the ideas of creatures in the divine essence, without seeing the divine essence itself. While this claim was an attempt to distinguish prophetic cognition from the beatific vision, St. Thomas points out that the ideas of creatures do not add anything to the divine essence, and thus in knowing those ideas, you would see the divine essence, and then thereby collapse that distinction between prophetic cognition and beatific vision. Instead of seeing things in the divine essence, a prophet, according to St. Thomas, is able to know supernatural truths through making judgments about sensory and intellectual species possessed by a prophet. These are also the basic elements in Aquinas' explanation for how we come to know naturally accessible truths. Yet Aquinas' account of prophetic cognition requires several modifications to these basic elements. In addition to the natural light of the age and intellect, a prophet is given a special light that allows him to make judgments that lead him to know supernatural truths. These judgments might be made with respect to knowledge acquired after the normal manner of human cognition, whereby we first know through the senses and eventually abstract intelligible species. What would distinguish a prophet's way of knowing in this case is that he judges the species through the prophetic light. At other times, however, God will place species directly into either the imagination or the intellect of the prophet. As St. Thomas notes, God sometimes infuses, quote, intelligible species into the mind itself, as is clear in the case of those who receive infused knowledge or wisdom, like Solomon and the apostles, end quote. Okay, so now to just turn to some criticisms of this hastily sketched account of Aquinas, but I think gives enough to get started on thinking about his account of prophetic cognition. Okay, so in recent years, St. Thomas's account of prophecy has been criticized by Fathers Terrell and Bonino. Terrell, for example, describes Thomas's account of prophetic cognition as the result of an unsuccessful attempt to unite Aristotelian and Augustinian accounts of knowledge. Terrell writes, quote, "It is clear that Thomas does not go all the way in his use of an Aristotelian theory of cognition, and that he does not respect one essential part of it. When he takes for granted the impression of images by God in the imagination of the prophet that would not have their origin in the external senses, or the infusion of intelligible species into the possible intellect that could not be abstracted from images by the operation of the active intellect, it is clear that he shows himself here to be more Augustinian than Aristotelian," end quote. A strict Aristotelian account would require that all phantasms and intellectual species be traceable to sense experience. Terrell goes on to describe the claim that species might be infused into the mind of a prophet as a, quote, brutal process, end quote, that is unworthy of both the creator and the dignity of his human creatures. Leveling a similar criticism, Father Bonino, for his part, writes, quote, "The miracle cannot be the rule. The idea of an infusion of species, therefore, stands in tension with what we otherwise know about the general orientation of Thomistic thought, and its concern to place the supernatural on another level than that of the interaction of natural causes," end quote. So Fathers Terrell and Bonino do not only criticize Aquinas' notion of infused intelligible species and infused phantasms, but also the idea that the gift of the prophetic light would be given episodically to a prophet rather than permanently given. According to these two theologians, then, Thomas misses an opportunity to provide an account of prophetic knowledge that is consistent with how God usually interacts with the world. As they see it, Aquinas' account requires frequent interventions from God into the natural order. And this is unseemly for a creator who is able to confer on his creatures powers that are sufficient for their own operations. Father Bonino proposes a model whereby divine intervention occurs only at the moment when God confers the prophetic light on someone, which would be given as a permanent part of the person's intellect. The prophetic light is not merely one element in prophetic knowledge among other elements, but is rather, in the words of Father Bonino, quote, "the very condition of the possibility of prophetic knowledge," end quote. Once the person is provided with the prophetic light, he will be able to discern supernatural truths through the normal process of human knowing. There will be no need to posit infused intelligible species or infused phantasms or any periodic infusion of the prophetic light into the intellect. Father Bonino is especially concerned to give full scope to the intellectual and cultural world of the prophet as matter for his prophecy. Aided by the prophetic light, a prophet inhabits his own world and discerns and announces supernatural truths in it that are hidden from others. For Father Bonino, the claim that any knowledge is infused into the mind of a prophet risks positing a parallel intellectual world side by side with the normal intellectual world of the prophet. Okay, so this is, I do take to be a good set of objections, and I'm going to offer what I take to be at least an attempt to reply to these objections. Okay, so despite the alternative model of prophetic cognition offered by Fathers Terrell and Bonino, there are good reasons for continuing to adhere to Aquinas' more complex account. So for some of the things prophets know cannot be extracted from normal human experience, even when that experience is viewed with the aid of the prophetic light. Knowledge of the future and knowledge of the Trinity are two examples of the type of knowledge that the accounts of Fathers Terrell and Bonino cannot explain. It is very much in keeping with the nature of prophecy to be concerned with foretelling the future. Aquinas identifies 3 different ways that a prophet might foretell the future. It seems to me that each one of these would require God to directly infuse either intelligible species or phantasms into the mind of a prophet. When a prophet foretells the future, he comes to see the future from the perspective of God's knowledge of these events, which are future for us, but of course present to God in his eternal knowledge. Aquinas identifies 2 ways that the future exists in God's understanding. In one way, God knows the future insofar as it exists in its causes. Following St. Jerome's division of prophecy, Aquinas labels prophecies based on this way of knowing the future the prophecy of threat. By this he means that someone foreknows that certain actions, for instance, will cause a particular outcome unless some other cause intervenes. Aquinas' example of this type of prophecy comes from the book of Jeremiah, where the prophet warns that the sins of Judah will lead to its destruction. This is a claim about what will occur at a future point in history, but it is acknowledged that if those who have been warned turn from their evil ways, the prophesied future destruction will not occur. It might not seem that any kind of knowledge would need to be infused into the mind of a prophet to make this type of prophecy. After all, sin and idolatry call out for God's justice, and the turning from sin evokes God's mercy. This can be known apart from God miraculously bestowing knowledge on the prophet. And if the prophet sees idolatry taking place, he should be able to prophesy without any infused knowledge. Yet, when Jeremiah and other prophets utter a prophecy of threat, they are not merely stating what would be knowable to any person who lives by faith, namely that idolatry will lead to punishment. To reduce the prophecy of threat to this would not even require the infused prophetic light. What distinguishes a prophecy of threat from any other prediction of punishment for sin is that the prophecy is making a particular claim about a specific outcome that will obtain, if the hearers do not change their ways. If, by contrast, I were to see an act of idolatry, I could say that this will lead to punishment, but I do not know whether this will occur in this life or the next, or how it might occur. Yet, in the prophecy of threat, some sort of punishment is being predicted as imminent unless the hearers change their ways. Ordinary experience can only indicate that at some point or other, in this life or the next, idolatry will be punished. The ability of the prophet to be more specific than this and to know with certainty that there is the risk of imminent punishment seems to me only explicable if the prophet is specially instructed by God through some sort of infused knowledge. In addition to knowing future things insofar as they exist in their causes, God knows future things in themselves. And this way of knowing gives rise to 2 other forms of prophecy, labeled by Aquinas, again following Jerome, as the prophecy of predestination and the prophecy of foreknowledge. The need for God to directly infuse knowledge into the prophet's mind to account for these types of prophecy is even more evident than it is for the prophecy of threat. Whatever God will bring about that exceeds the powers of created causes could be known by the prophecy of predestination. For example, that God will send a Messiah or that a virgin will conceive are prophecies of this sort. The remaining type of prophecy, the prophecy of foreknowledge, refers to God's knowledge of what will be brought about by human free choices. If the prophet could only rely on knowledge derived from ordinary experience, he could not make these latter types of prophecy. Human experience can lead us to know that there is an all-good God and infer from this that he orders the universe to achieve various goods in accord with his providence. Yet our experience, even when reflected upon with the aid of the prophetic light, cannot disclose what particular goods God will bring about in the future. In the absence of infused knowledge, it might be possible for Isaiah to have some sort of moral certainty that a Messiah will eventually be given to Israel, and perhaps conjecture on plausible grounds that the Messiah will be born of a virgin. Or to take another example, apart from infused knowledge, Christ himself might firmly trust that he will rise from the dead on the 3rd day. Yet it seems preferable to attribute something more than moral certainty, plausible conjecture, or firm trust to these prophetic utterances. Indeed, in the absence of being directly instructed by God about such matters, it is difficult to see what sort of experience could even make it reasonable for a prophet to have moral certainty or firm faith in such matters. Similarly, conferring only the prophetic light will not enable someone to know what another person will freely choose. If Nathan prophesies, for example, that a son of David will freely build a temple for the Lord, this would require infused knowledge, since nothing in his present experience could make known the future free choices of Solomon. There are other teachings of the prophet that, unlike future contingents, are the sort of things that are noble in themselves, but nevertheless not able to be known by the natural powers of the human intellect. Some of these things remain unknowable even with the aid of the prophetic light, illuminating whatever can be drawn from ordinary human experience. By reflecting on human experience, we can come to know that there is one God who is good, wise, and powerful. Yet none of this will disclose the triune character of God, even if the prophetic light were added to the knower. For our knowledge of God through experience is based on reasoning from effects to their ultimate cause, and this reasoning terminates in the one divine nature through which the persons of the Trinity act in an undivided way in creating and sustaining the universe. One way the Trinity was revealed to a prophet, according to Aquinas, occurs through angels teaching this to Isaiah, when the six-winged seraphim proclaim, "Holy, holy, holy." While the precise details of Isaiah's vision remain obscure, it would seem to rely on an infusion or rearrangement of phantasms in the mind of the prophet, which discloses something of the triune character of God, such that in this threefold declaration, something of each divine person is revealed. Aside from infused species, the episodic possession of the prophetic light is another distinctive feature of Aquinas' account of prophecy. The inner illumination given to the intellect of the prophet is a temporary gift, and one that might be given to a prophet several times in his life. According to St. Thomas, we should think of the prophetic light in this way because Scripture indicates that prophets are sometimes unable to prophesy. Aquinas, for instance, points to a passage from the second book of Kings, where Elisha is unable to know what causes the Shunammite woman anguish. After her son dies, she comes to Elisha, but his servant Gehazi tries to prevent her from being received by Elisha, and so he says, quote, "Let her alone, for her soul is in anguish, and the Lord has hid it from me, and has not told me." End quote. The inability to prophesy at a given moment might, however, be explained in other ways besides positing the withdrawal of the prophetic light. It is sometimes the case, for example, that any regular human being might not be able to run through the steps of a certain argument or recall an important bit of information, even though he or she retains the natural light of the agent intellect at all times. Fatigue or distraction might pose an obstacle to using our intellectual powers at certain moments without calling into question the very possession of those powers. Perhaps Elisha's comment that the Lord has hidden something from him is only a way of talking about this inability to prophesy rather than giving Thomas's preferred explanation for why he cannot. Even if this were so, Aquinas points to other passages in Scripture to support his claim about the episodic possession of the prophetic light. Aquinas also points to Isaiah, where we read, quote, "He wakes in the morning, and in the morning he wakes my ear, that I may hear him as a master," end quote. The image of the Lord speaking again and again to the prophet each morning indicates for Thomas that the light by which the prophet sees supernatural truths is not given to him as a permanent gift. Instead, it is received for a certain time and purpose, and then given again as God deems fit. St. Thomas sees this also indicated by the very way that prophecy is often described in Scripture, as when Scripture says that the Lord spoke to a given prophet, or that the hand of the Lord was on a prophet. In these ways, Scripture describes the Lord as coming to the prophet in some new moment and implicitly departing from him. For the Lord is not said to speak forever to a prophet or to always keep his hand on the prophet. The findings of historical criticism provide another reason, admittedly uncountenanced by Aquinas, for affirming only episodic possession of the prophetic light. If, for example, the Pentateuch was compiled from different sources over a long stretch of history, then the many people involved in producing the final form of these 5 books would all count as prophets. Yet some of these people will have a much more significant role in this process than others. It is certainly reasonable to attribute to Moses a long-standing or perhaps even permanent possession of the prophetic light. But it would seem superfluous to attribute this to each and every person who played a much more minor role in producing the final form of the Pentateuch. Okay, so just to quickly wrap up, by way of conclusion here, the desire to explain prophetic knowledge as both ensconced in the mental and cultural world of the prophet, but aided by the gift of a special light that allows the prophet to see further than others is laudable. Indeed, I believe that the account of prophecy defended by Fathers Terrell and Bonino is compelling because in many ways, not in all ways, but in many, it no doubt describes much of what we would identify as prophetic knowledge. In other words, a prophet often comes to see things in his ordinary human experience that others do not see because he is aided by the prophetic light. While the alternative account of prophetic knowledge that these Dominicans offer seeks to make Aquinas' account more consistent with an Aristotelian theory of cognition, Aquinas' own account, as we have seen, has frequent recourse to scriptural examples to support his claim about the infusion of species and the temporary possession of the prophetic light. Moreover, the biblical basis for Aquinas' claim about the prophetic light seems even stronger now that we recognize not only the role of prominent individual authors for certain books of the Bible, but also the minor role of many other contributors. Finally, certain prophetic teachings about future contingents or doctrines like the Trinity require more than can be gleaned from ordinary experience. The infusion of species plays an important role in explaining how a prophet can possess this type of knowledge. For these reasons, the modified Aristotelianism of Aquinas' account of prophetic cognition remains defensible. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes.
Father Benino, whose presence honors us and terrifies me.
Very interesting. I would like to make 3 observations. The first one, Father Torrell and myself, we distinguish the exegetical side of the reading of Aquinas, and it's absolutely clear that Aquinas spoke of the infusion of species. So
No, I'm not on
this point is clearly, but we have tried to respond to some interest in modern exegesis. That is, not to multiply miracle to explain the biblical text. So first, distinguish these 2 aspects. Second observation, perhaps you put on the same level infused knowledge and infused species. So Father Torrell and it's not a revelation, it's an hypothesis, but what we try to not to do is to introduce new species. For instance, as you say, the prophecy, Jerusalem will be destroyed. Well, what species do we need? We need the species of Jerusalem and the species of the destruction. And it's the prophetical light that which is absolutely necessary for the knowledge of future. It's the prophetic light that brings the judgment on Jerusalem will be destroyed. So, infused knowledge and infused species are 2 different problematics. Okay. And my third observation is only an observation. The question of the light of prophecy as momentaneous light. Aquinas is very clear that prophecy is not an habitus. It is not something that the prophet can possess and keep by himself. I think is in opposition with the Arabic prophetic theory. Because for the Arabic prophetic theory, the disposition of the subject are very important for prophecy. Only people who have a certain disposition, bodily disposition, intellectual disposition, can receive the light of prophecy. Whereas for the Christian theology, prophecy can be given to everybody, to the little one, not only to the great philosopher. Well,
Okay, so let me ask you, so you were saying it's important to distinguish between the infused knowledge and the infused species. How do you see that distinction operating in Aquinas' account of prophecy, just on the exegetical level?
Well, that means that the origin of the species is a natural origin.
Okay.
That is the idea of a virgin and a birth of the Messiah. We can form proposition. The Messiah will born from a virgin. But we cannot affirm. We need the intellectual, prophetical light to affirm. But to form the proposition, we do not need other species. It's possible. It's clear that for Aquinas, we joined what Thérèse Corey said yesterday. For Aquinas, there is also a direct emanation from the celestial bodies or from God in the mind of the prophet. But
okay, so you're thinking, because I was wondering, how you would account for, say, knowledge of the future, or things like knowledge of the Trinity, without. But you're saying there's no infused knowledge or species that contribute to that. It's just the infused light.
There is the Son, the Father. They are human concepts.
Sure.
Which are in an analogous way used to reveal the mysteries of Trinity. But the concepts themselves can come from our experience.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking, I could certainly have the concepts of Father and Son, for instance, from my normal experience, and I could even have the prophetic light, but what would allow me to judge that this somehow applies to God?
Well,
is it the light? Is the light sufficient? But the light is sufficient.
The certainty of the union of the notion of Father and Son and Holy Spirit.
So you think the light just allows you to see more deeply into the concept of Father, say, than ordinary?
Yeah.
That would be sufficient for.
Because they are concepts which are analogously used in theology.
Okay.
So
Sure.
Analogy means that at the beginning these are human concepts.
Okay, thanks. So Therese is trying to get in. So,
So I mean, I'm very sympathetic to this line, but also to some of the worries that you had, and I wondered if a way of bringing these two things together is that, maybe it might be the case that the prophet is often operating with phantasms or intelligible species that he already has, but there's a step that has to happen before the judgment is made, or in relation to the judgment being made, and I think this takes us to Francis's paper. Somehow those two phantasms or those two species have to be conjoined to each other. So there's got to be some moment in which Jerusalem and being in flames, or Jerusalem and the destruction, have to come together in the imagination. And so I think it's not enough to just have phantasms populating our memory plus the light of judgment. There needs to be something that the imagination does to bring together the Jerusalem and the destruction, and then the light is able to confirm that this is something that's going to happen. But I think there has to be something that God does to the imagination beyond simply the infusing of the light, even if all it is combining the phantasms we already have to make a more complex phantasm.
But don't you think that the light is able to act on imagination to form this complex?
I mean, I wouldn't think that that's what Aquinas is that's what intellectual light does in Aquinas. I don't think it's able to do that by itself.
This is, I do apologize.
Okay,
If there's one very, very brief question, we can do it, but it does need to be a brief question.
My brief question is, I don't think that judgment put together two species. You have to have a species to make a judgment. So I would not buy this account of judgment. So so in your life.
Thank
Well, thank you very much to our speaker and for this lively conversation. Our third speaker, and I'm actually going to ask, I'm going to ask Therese actually if you would mind handing out handouts for our speaker. Our final speaker this morning is Dr. Andres Ayala, who is a philosophy professor at the House of Formation of his religious order in Chilham, Maryland. His research, concretized in 2 books and several papers, endeavors to distinguish Aquinas' own doctrine from the Kantian misinterpretation of Aquinas, which is at work in some instances of modern Thomism. His paper today is entitled Thomistic Abstraction, Re-Incarnating Philosophy into Human Existence After Kant. Dr. Ayala recently survived a house fire and is recovering, and for this reason, he will be presenting his paper via Zoom, and we're very grateful to have him with us here today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, Thomistic Abstraction is my paper. I'm trying to propose a certain understanding of Thomistic Abstraction as the true alternative to the epistemology of Kant. So I would like to begin by connecting Aquinas' doctrine of abstraction with the problem of universals in order to give an idea of my approach. Kant, like Plato, and like any other fundamental philosopher, confronted directly the problem of universals. That is to say, they both realized that a portion of human knowledge was about the universal and the necessary, and wondered what made that knowledge possible, what was the value of said knowledge, and or what was it about. For both of them, it seemed impossible that the universal content of this knowledge should come from the particular reality. Each of them, however, took a different road in explaining human understanding. Plato thought that if knowledge is by likeness, and the universal is not like the particular, then knowledge of the universal cannot be about particular things, but only about universal ideas subsisting as such in a different level of reality. Kant, attentive to the fact that universal knowledge is about the particular, transformed human understanding into a function of the universalization of the particular, where intelligibility, universality, and necessity were the result of the subject's activity on the particular matter provided by sensibility. Plato considered all knowledge as a certain taking part in reality, as a receiving something from reality. And this is why he needed to posit a reality, the separate ideas, that could provide the human subject with the universal content of understanding. Kant realized that reality was nothing but the particular. And this is why he needed to posit the origin of universal content, not in reality, but in the subject. Both of them, Plato and Kant, however, denied universality to the particular material reality. And both of them did this, in my view, because they departed from a consideration of the universal as an event of consciousness. That is, they departed from the universal with the mode of being it has in the mind. The fact which Plato and Kant were trying to explain is the universal in the mind, that is, the universal with the conditions of abstraction and immateriality with which it appears to the mind. None of them found anything like that in everyday reality. And so one of them said that the mind's universal was an imitation of a different reality, the ideas. And the other said that this universal was the result of the subject's activity on the material reality. Aquinas, allegedly following Aristotle, took a different road. Like Plato, Aquinas considered knowledge like an encounter with reality, like a being perfected by the other, and in that sense, he considered knowledge a taking part in the other as such. Like Kant, however, Aquinas realized that human understanding refers to the sensible, material reality. But Aquinas, with Aristotle, thought that there was something universal and necessary in the things themselves, and therefore that the universal in the mind had its origin in the particular perceived through the senses. This is why Aquinas postulated a subjective activity by which human intelligence obtains this universal content from the particular reality. This activity is what I will call abstraction in this paper. Clearly, abstraction in Aquinas admits several meanings, which I cannot I cannot make those distinctions today in this reduced version of my paper. I refer here to abstraction as action of the agent intellect, and therefore Thérèse Cory's first meaning, but insofar as it justifies abstraction as a mode of cognition, so Cory's second meaning of abstraction, a mode of cognition and or as act of the possible intellect. What I want to do is to justify the agent intellect's taking something universal from the particular reality of experience. And in this way, justify the validity of human understanding as a true engagement with a meaningful reality, that is to say, with a reality full of meaning, pregnant of meaning. Some scholars might argue that this is not what Aquinas thought about abstraction as a psychological process. I think their disagreement is not so much a matter of textual interpretation. You can find text for anything you want, in a sense, but one of doctrinal plausibility. I have suggested that Aquinas' abstraction is a subjective activity by which human intelligence obtains its universal content from the particular reality. Now, some scholars do not see how a doctrine like this is plausible, defensible, or even coherent with reality. Is it not obvious that human understanding's content is universal and therefore cannot come from the particular reality? So, some scholars tend to interpret textual evidence in Aquinas in a way that makes Aquinas' doctrine more plausible for them. This is why my main concern in this paper is to offer 3 principles of Thomistic epistemology that help making sense of Aquinas' doctrine as presented here. In this presentation, for reasons of space, I will omit the consideration of Cory's 3 objections to a theory of abstraction according to the unwrapper model, which is similar to what I'm proposing, as well as Pasnau's claim of a content fallacy in Aquinas in Aquinas' characterization of the agent intellect's action. I cannot do that today. Okay, so 3 principles for understanding Aquinas' doctrine of abstraction. The first, one perfection can exist in different modes of being. It is possible, and this is the principle, that one and the same perfection subsists in 2 different ways or modes of being. For example, St. Thomas's example, whiteness can exist together with sweetness in sugar, or together with saltiness in salt. The difference between the modes of beings, together with sweetness in one case, without sweetness in the other, does not change whiteness, which remains the same. In a similar way, the nature of a corporeal thing can exist together with the particular determinations of an individual in reality, but can also exist separated from those determinations in our mind, remaining the same. This is why, for Aquinas, the universal content of human understanding can belong to reality. Aquinas distinguishes what we know, the nature, the essence, the whatness of the thing, from its mode of being, abstracted in the mind, or together with particular determinations in reality. And in this way, Aquinas can justify that we know a nature which belongs to reality, even when its mode of being is not the same that that nature has in reality. This principle, which is Aquinas' systematic response to Plato's approach regarding the problem of universals, appears to be the most forgotten principle in Thomistic epistemology, and perhaps the most needed to recover. In my view, Kant's whole system is based on the lack of distinction between universal content and its mode of being in the mind. Aquinas is many times assimilated to Kant precisely because this principle is ignored. And I refer to transcendental Thomism for this. Kant, Rahner, Lonergan, and von Balthasar particularly. So the second principle, metaphysical distinction justifies gnosiological separation. How can we know separately 2 things that cannot exist separately? This would be the question. In response, the fact that 2 things cannot exist separately does not mean that those 2 things are not really distinct. The real distinction makes possible their cognitive separation. Now, the essence of a corporeal thing cannot exist separately from its particular determinations, but it is still distinct from them. Therefore, this essence can be known separately from its individual determinations. There are other instances in which 2 things cannot exist separately and are nonetheless really distinct, according to Aquinas. A corporeal substance cannot exist without its accidents, but the accidents are not the substance, they are distinct. Matter and form in corporeal things cannot exist without each other, but they are distinct. And most importantly, they must be distinguished. Otherwise, this corporeal thing would be a perfection without limits, form without matter, or would be without determination and so disappear, matter without form. Thus, given that 2 things that must be together can also be necessarily distinct, One cannot deny a priori the possibility of knowing separately something which exists always together with something else. Consequently, it cannot be denied a priori that the essence we know separately is a real aspect of the particular thing. Even if the essence exists in reality inseparably from its particular determinations, the essence can also in reality be distinct from those determinations and thus can be known in itself. In this respect, the justification of abstraction is the possibility that the essence is something really distinct from its particular determinations, even if this essence cannot exist without those same particular determinations. Now, in saying that abstraction is justified by a distinction in reality, are we not falling into the Platonic trap? That is, into considering the object of the intellect as something separated in reality? Clearly not. Distinguishing is not the same as separating, nor is affirming real distinction the same as affirming real separation. Okay, and the third principle, hope I have time, the possibility of experience as source of intelligible content. With this third principle, I mean to suggest that experience, the everyday experience of a mature human consciousness, provides us with much more than a chaotic and disorganized bunch of elements, much more than a simple raw material to work with subjectively. Cornelio Fabro's research has endeavored to show, firstly, that from a phenomenological point of view, maybe I have to, here it is, that from a phenomenological point of view, normal human experience is an experience of wholes, not of parts, and that it is the whole that determines the appearance of the parts and not vice versa. Secondly, he shows that everyday human perception regards objects presenting themselves in the complexity of three levels of objectivity, or as he calls them, objectual planes: unification, configuration, and qualification. For example, when I perceive a tree, there are many things that come together in my perception of the tree. I know that it has a trunk supported by roots, that if the season allows it, it may have fruits or flowers, etc. But all those things, instead of dispersing my attention or confusing me, reinforce my persuasion of being in front of a tree and not, say, a car or a house. The tree is perceived as a unified object, as a unity of complexity. The second objectual plane is the level of configuration. Every object appears with a certain configuration, that is, a certain distribution of parts in space, which is proper to the kind of thing I'm looking at, and allows me to know what kind of thing is in front of me, a tree, and even a certain kind of tree, insofar as each species of tree has its own particular configuration. The third objectual plane is the level of sensible qualities, such as color. We could never perceive a configuration if it did not appear vested in a variety of colors, which again are in one way or another related to this particular object of perception. These objectual planes are heterogeneous and so irreducible to each other. But this does not make them incompatible. Rather, they offer themselves always together with a certain necessary connection, insofar as a corporeal object will always present a certain configuration, and a configuration will always be accompanied by its colors. even if a body does not always present the same figure, and a certain figure may not always be accompanied by the same colors. The fact is that in perception, the three levels of objectivity appear together with an undeniable character of objective unification, which presupposes, according to Fabro, the real belonging of multiple contents to one and the same object. There are other considerations that I cannot make regarding the process of reconstruction in the subject of the object. No, but I cannot go there. Thus, it seems artificial to separate in the object of experience the object's different levels of objectivity, quality, configuration, and meaning. And as a result, human experience could be considered the source not only of sensible content, but also of intelligible content. For our purposes, and I'm almost 1 minute, for our purposes, it could be enough to highlight the possibility of the presence in the data of experience of much more than sensible qualities. More precisely, the object's unification as such a kind of object indicates the presence of meaning in the object of perception, a meaning depending on the appearance of the object, on its unification, configuration, and qualities, and not on the rules of the subject. In the act of perception, each faculty is actualized by its own formal object. The intellect, in particular, is actualized by the object's meaning, its whatness, a meaning which is read into the phantasm of sensibility thanks to the light of the agent intellect. The intellect can read the phantasms with the proper light, and the phantasms can manifest their respective essences in the same way that accidental features reveal their substance. In Thomistic metaphysics, the accidents do not hide but manifest the substance, like a sincere word manifests the heart of the speaker. In short, the phenomenology of perception does not seem to substantiate Kant's separating human understanding's intelligible content from the object of sensible experience. This separation was probably based on Kant's presuppositions regarding experience coming from Hume. If, with St. Thomas, we admit the possibility of this intelligible content existing in the material reality with a different mode of being, then Aquinas' theory of abstraction appears as the most plausible solution of the problem of universals. Thank you. Keep in mind, I cannot see anyone. I think Therese Corey was there.
For questions, if people would let me bring the microphone to them so that Father can hear you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question is about the term intelligible. So Aquinas says things like sometimes he speaks of the essences of material substances as being intelligible in potency. Sometimes he speaks of them as being outside the intelligible order altogether. So it seems that intelligible can have several meanings for Aquinas. And then there's also the fact that there seems to be a relational aspect. So they are not intelligible to us, but they are, of course, intelligible to God, since He's the cause of them. So I'm just wondering how does all of this fit together with especially your third thesis?
Yeah, more than with the third is related to the first thing I said. This difference between content and mode of being of the content is also a difference, the difference that you are noticing between the two meanings of intelligible. For Aquinas, there is intelligibility, there is something, there is a participation of the exemplar idea of God in the thing itself. The thing itself participates of what God wanted to make in that thing. So there is intelligibility already actual, in a sense, in the thing itself, which is the essence, what it is. The whatness is already there. That is one of the meanings of intelligible, or one of the meanings of universal, is the essence or the whatness of the thing itself, the nature. That's the object of knowledge. But that object of knowledge is not intelligible in the second way, because intelligible also means the mode of being abstracted from individuating conditions. And Aquinas distinguishes those two meanings of intelligible in question 85. Don't remember exactly what article, I think it's article 1, objections 3 and 4, and objection 1 as well. So it is impotency insofar as it still does not have the mode of the intelligible mode of being which the agent intellect provides. In that sense, it's impotency, but in a different sense, actualizes with its content the possible intellect. There is a few texts of Aquinas in which this interplay between what experience provides and the intellect is impotency of something which is actual in reality. But reality is impotency from something which is actual only in intelligence. But that which is actual in reality is the content of human understanding. And this is what is missing many times in the interpretation of Aquinas. The content is out there, but it's not out there in a way accessible to me. And this is what the agent intellect provides. It's a mode of being to a content that remains the same. And this is my one of the things that I'm always pushing to this distinction between mode of being and content in Aquinas that I think needs to be rediscovered, I think, if it makes sense.
Thank you very much, Father. I really enjoyed that, and I think I agree with everything you were saying. But I guess I was wondering, so you mentioned your objection to the, or that you were defending a version of the unwrapping model against objections to that model. Could you say a little bit more about what those objections are and how you respond to them?
Therese Corey points out 3 objections. I have them here in the longer version of the paper. Is the transmission problem is one of them. Given the objection is this: given that the phantasm possesses only a sensible content or represents accidental features, how can the phantasm transmit to the mind the intelligible content or the substantial features? Or in other words, how can the agent intellect extract from the phantasm that which is not there in the first place? That's one of the objections. The objection, this is my response, the objection appears to presuppose that the intelligible content is part of the sensible content, as if the intelligible content had to be somehow sensible in order to be perceived by the intellect. In response, the fact that the senses can perceive in material reality and in the phantasm that represents it only sensible content does not mean that material reality and the phantasm that represents it possesses only sensible features. It may well be that sensible appearances are words from a substance that can be read by another superior eye. Thus, in the same way that it is metaphysically possible and even necessary that the accidents participate in the being of the substance, and thus the substance is present in the being and action of the accidents, it is also possible that substantial features are present in the representation of accidental features, unless one wants to suggest that the senses strip away those substantial features, which we do not. Indeed, the point of having senses is to bring the subject into contact with reality in its concreteness, in order for the intelligence to see in that reality the essential features which are its lot. And I quote Therese Corey's the best, she said it perfect. The embodied human intellect is naturally directed toward the qualities or essences that are in material object, and it depends on the senses for access to such objects. Thus, the senses are not the obstacle, but the vehicle for human intellectual cognition. This is from her self-knowledge, beautiful. And keep in mind, I don't think she agrees with the, I mean, I'm subscribing to the unwrapper model, okay? But at the same time, this is precisely, I agree completely with that, because I think it's the connection between what we both are trying to, okay.
Well, thank you all. We come to the end of our session, and our one remaining duty is to thank all of our speakers.
Thank you. See you.